This is Chris tweaking the ever-living crap out of his SI joint on his speed squats last week, which freaked him right out because he has a long history of low back issues and was worried that his meet prep was done for. But this is Chris running way better looking speed squats and pulling 495 off a block on the same day without any pain just 1 week later. So how did we get Chris from unable to stand up straight to training like nothing ever happened in just 1 week? We're going to get into everything we got Chris to do to get his SIJ feeling and working better, and how we're changing his approach to speed squats so that he doesn't do it again. But first, we got to talk a little bit about pain and the SI joint itself. And before we do that, if you're stuck with anything powerlifting related or you want to make better progress than you are now, hit the link below and join the team. You'll get direct access to individualized coaching from me every single day, plus access to my programming app with rock solid options that will help tailor to you. And we've now even got movement prep plans. Check it out quick because on April 1st, the price is increasing from $49 a month to $99 a month. Don't miss out on being able to lock in that lower rate. Because pain doesn't always mean that something is broken, and in the context of powerlifting, you got a better chance of being struck by lightning while winning the lottery than you do of actually causing real damage to the SI joint, which is the sacroiliac joint, the junction between the ilium of the pelvis and your sacrum, the bone at the base of your spine. What do we need it to do? Well, it needs to be able to transfer force from the hip to the spine and absorb some shock as it does so. Now, when people hurt their SIJ, they often feel a pop and they often talk about how the joint went out of place. That is not what's happening. The SI joint is not going to pop out of alignment. Well, I mean it can, but that's like a get in a head-on car collision at 100 kilometers an hour with your feet on the dash and the airbag tries to rip your leg off sort of thing. And that is a surgeon problem, not go see your local chiropractor problem. Because if we look at SIJ anatomy, we're going to notice a few things. First, it's classified as an amphiarthroidal atypical synovial joint, which is a lot of words. Amphiarthroidal tells us that there's hardly any motion available there. Synovial means that it has a synovial capsule full of fluid surrounding the front half of the joint. And the reason that it's atypical is the synovial capsule only covers that front half. The posterior side is classified as fibrous, meaning the backside is encased in some very thick and very strong ligaments. Second, if we look at the articular surfaces, they interlock pretty darn congruently, so we've got a lot of strong stuff holding the joint together, and there's not a lot of room for that stuff to move, which means that we're going to have a really hard time causing true structural damage to the ligaments that hold it together, which works in our advantage for force transmission, but it can also work a little bit against us when things aren't working quite right. Now, that's where the pain equation comes into play, because even if that joint is held really tightly together and really good at transmitting force, those ligaments aren't going to love being the only things helping with that force transmission, because pain isn't a matter of how damaged something is, it's a matter of how much threat our nervous system is perceiving. And with how important being able to transfer force through the SIJ is for our ability to survive and exist as humans, the nervous system is going to be very hyperprotective of that joint. So a little bit of those ligaments getting yanked on can often lead to a lot of pain, because those ligaments being yanked on tells the brain that the musculature responsible for controlling the pelvis ain't quite doing its job. Plus, with Chris's long service run in the military, he jacked up his back multiple times and was always told how much of a mess it was. And every time we tweak something, we're going to be more likely to feel pain again with less and less of a real tweak, especially if we're made to believe that we are broken unless we do something about it. Oh, and that pop you feel when you do tweak your SIJ, that's an expansion of the synovial capsule as the joint moves to its end range, leading to air bubble formation, and that makes a noise. It's the same thing as cracking your knuckles. It's called cavitation. Even if my mom doesn't like it, it doesn't mean anything bad is happening. It just means that those ligaments are going to be getting tugged on as that joint moves to end range. So what were the goals that we set for Chris as we were getting started? First, we needed to find a way to get the ligaments surrounding his SIJ to be more okay with being loaded. We needed to make sure his hip range of motion was in check, so his SIJ wasn't being forced to make up for the hips. We needed to make sure his bracing strategy and strength was there to control the pelvis in relation to his spine. And we needed to refine his squat technique so he's less likely to shove his SIJ to the point where those ligaments were getting tugged on, all while re-educating his nervous system to recognize that his SIJ was in fact okay. And how did we do that? Well, we started with a combination of hip internal rotation access, hip extension access, and isometric bracing drills. For the hip IR, a 90-90 is one of the easiest ways to get into end range and lightly expose the SIJ to some force while we do it. And we don't want to just be in the 90-90 position. We want to actively contract in that position so that we are learning to better control it while learning to better control that SIJ against hip rotation. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to alternate between trying to drive the back foot down into the floor, pushing towards hip external rotation, with trying to drive the knee down and picking the foot up on the backside, pulling us into hip IR. It doesn't matter if the back foot actually lifts as long as you're getting the feeling of that lateral hip working. Eventually, you're going to be able to get some lift. We also want to make sure that we're not cheating the hip rotation by leaning the torso forward to pick the back leg up. So I like to get a lifter to set up with a bench, wall, or couch next to them so that they can hold their torso perfectly upright. For hip extension and learning to control his pelvis there, I had him do what I call the active half kneel hip flexor stretch. Active because we're actively contracting through motion, half kneel because we're in a half kneel, and hip flexor because, well, we're stretching the hip flexors. The target here is to set your brace so you're not dumping into lumbar extension, and then actively squeeze your glute to push you forward into a hip flexor stretch. Once you have that stretch, then you're going to keep your glutes on and use your hip flexors to pull you back into glute tension. The goal here is to keep the glutes and hip flexors on to get us some hip extension access while teaching us to use the hip flexors together with the abdominals to better control the pelvis. For bracing drills, since it was the bottom of his squat that we were concerned with, I prioritized a bear crawl plank, on all fours with the knees slightly off the ground, and then you're going to use your abs, lats, and hip flexors to try to pull your toes against your hands. It looks really easy, but if you contract hard, it gets very hard very fast. We want to hold the hardest contraction that we can until we start to feel fatigue here. And as soon as he started to establish enough control with those, we wanted to build it into his ability to transfer force from hip extension through that SIJ. And for this, there isn't much better than a single leg RDL and a split squat with some hip flexor intent. For the single leg RDL, the key points are, first, we want to hold on to something so that we are not limited by our balance. Second, we want the knee traveling backwards, not forwards, so that it is a true hinge. Third, we want to set our brace hard and actively use our hip flexors to pull us into that hinge. Fourth, we want to make sure that we are rolling into hip internal rotation and not opening the hips and cheating externally. And if you do it right, you should feel a big lateral hip stretch in the bottom and a giant glute squeeze to the top. For the split squats, here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to set up a 4 to 6 inch box to make the levers a little bit better for touching the hip flexors for the front foot. So we're going to get into a long stance, set your brace, squeeze the back glute hard, and use your glute to push you forward into hip flexor stretch, similar to the half kneel as you get to the bottom. Then we just want to use the hip flexors to pull us back to the top. Doing it right, you'll get a big hip flexor stretch, and you should feel a little bit of a pump deep in the abdomen. And as far as sets and reps go here, we want him to spam all of the prep work. And what that means is we're going to do it for 1 to 2 sets of 90 to 120 seconds on the stretches and reps until he gets some fatigue on the movements, performed as many times as he could fit into the schedule. Why? When the stimulus is low, because we can't handle much loading, we need to pull the frequency lever so that we can get something out of it. And to seal the deal, we need to start challenging all of that in training. So we loaded the single leg RDLs and hip flexor split squats, plus we added a few movements to challenge his brace ability. Namely, the cable reverse squat, where we got Chris to lay on the floor with a cable attached to both of his ankles. His goal there, drive his low back into the floor like a dead bug, then pull his knees up towards his chest with a slow controlled pull for 2 to 3 sets of 15 to 20 reps, pushed as hard as he could tolerate. And that's what got him back to being able to move and train within a week, but it still leaves the speed squat intent tweaks that we made. Because one of the most common misconceptions with speed work is that the goal is just to move as fast as possible. Nope. We want a high bar speed, but we want that speed to come from being as precise with our positioning and contraction as possible. Because on Chris's old squats, where he did tweak his back, he was going for a super hard rebound, which we want on the 1.5s, but he was just falling into that rebound, not pushing there and contracting out of it. So what I told Chris is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Because on speed work, we want to be slow enough that we can have that precision, and then once we have the precision, then we can bring the assertiveness into the contraction. With 1.5 squats, again, we want hard rebound. It's necessary to get the most out of them, but getting that rebound needs to come from feeling your brace and hip flexors hard at that halfway point, then taking all that brace and hip flexor tension to drive you back down into the hole as solid as possible. That's what the pull cue you're always hearing me say in the vlogs means. Because yes, we don't want enough hip flexor contraction that it gets in the way of hip extension, but if we have some, the pelvis isn't going to be getting yanked around as the hips extend, and it's going to be a whole lot harder to expose the SIJ. And that is it. Now that Chris is in the clear, we still want him proceeding with some caution on his main work to make sure that everything is in the pocket, and we still want him on the range of motion access stuff, but we don't need him running it all day, every day. Just enough that he's still able to display the range. Because as long as he's training those single leg RDLs and hip flexor split squats, that's going to be enough to keep the range of motion going and his ability to transfer force through his SIJ high. And if you are struggling with anything in the gym and don't know what you're doing with your programming, your technique, or intent, hit the link below and join the team, because I want to give you one-on-one level attention so that you can know exactly what it is that you need to be doing just like that to drive progress. We've got 2 days left to lock in $49 per month until the price jumps to $99 on April 1st, so don't miss out on the lower rates because you will be kicking yourself if you do. Now I just hope I didn't look creepy talking to the camera.